John 21:15-22. After they had eaten their breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, do you love me more than these?" Peter said, "Yes, teacher, you know that I'm your friend." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time, Jesus put the question, "Simon, do you love me?" Peter said, "Yes, teacher, you know that I'm your friend." Jesus replied, "Tend my sheep." A third time, Jesus asked him, "Simon, do you love me as a friend would?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" a third time. So he said, "You know everything, teacher. You know that I am your friend." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." The truth of the matter is, when you were young, you put on your own belt and walked where you liked. But when you get old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will put a belt around you and take you where you don't want to go. With these words, Jesus indicated the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then the Savior said, "Follow me." Peter turned around and noticed that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them, the one who had leaned over during the supper and asked, "Teacher, which one will hand you over?" Seeing him, Peter was prompted to ask, "But what about him, teacher?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to stay behind until I come, what does it matter to you? You're to follow me."
"88 of us had gathered for summer orientation, for we were working with student summer ministries in North Carolina, and all of us would be working in different contexts, some at retreat centers, some at summer camps, some working in churches, working with youth, but we all gathered in one place after all our various orientations on that last evening, a commissioning, if you will, and we gathered outside by a pond. And as we sat there, as Caitlin reminded us of the story, from around the bend came a rowboat with Kay, Hal, and Frank. Kay and Hal, the disciples, Frank sitting in the middle, Peter, and they rowed in. As Caitlin came to the part of the story about Peter jumping out of the boat, Frank popped up, as evidently they had rehearsed. He jumped so hard, he flipped the boat. Two unexpected disciples went swimming and had not prepared. But Frank had on his swim trunks underneath his garb. And Frank was so excited about making it to shore, he never realized he left the other disciples in the muck and mud. You could see the look on all their faces. But as the story continued, as two of the disciples came to shore with muddy garb, they all gathered and sat down at an open fire where there was breakfast, in our case, dinner, where we had gathered. And the dialogue continued with some laughter for what they had just experienced because they couldn't hold it in, but some laughter of just being together. And then began the dialogue we just heard. "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." I love this story. Sort of the reminder over and over again of how do we love, and the call for all of us to feed the sheep, to feed the world, to feed the hungry, to feed those who need nourishment beyond food in whatever way. And then Peter, as Jesus says it again, Peter, I imagine, looking over his shoulder, seeing the beloved disciple, and looks back at Jesus saying, well, what about him? I think sometimes we're all a bit like that. Whenever something difficult or we're being asked to do something else large, we sort of look over our shoulder and say, well, can't she help out too? But love and faith are fickle at times. In 1994, if you can remember or were alive then, perhaps you were becoming hooked on must-see TV on NBC, which would begin the evening with Friends and then end with ER. I watched ER religiously. If I wasn't going to be at home, I put the VHS tape, remember those, and put it in the VCR, making sure I saw every bit. At the end of the first season, in May 1995, as TV season was sort of ending, there was a wedding on ER. Carol Hathaway was marrying Tag, her beloved. And the scene is set. All the ER folks gathered, some as bridesmaids or attendants, and Carol appears in her most beautiful dress. And one of the other cast members says, looks like we're ready to go. And there standing, the priest says, we're missing the groom. Carol wanders off and finds Tag sitting in the church's gardens. And Carol asks, Tag, how are you doing? Tag responds, it's beautiful out here, isn't it? Carol, yeah, it is. We've got a whole church full of our friends and family waiting. Tag, are you scared? A little. Me too. And Tag continues, I was thinking that maybe you don't love me enough. Carol, sitting on the bench with him, Tag, I love you. And then Tag, sort of almost as Jesus would say it to us, do you really? I was waiting in the sacristy. I was thinking that you really don't love me. I've known all along, and I've just been kidding myself. Carol, a bit shocked, says, I wouldn't be marrying you if I don't love you. Then Tag sort of tells of his love. I wake every morning and thank God for bringing you into my life. I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes just to watch you sleep. When we're at the movies and your hand brushes against mine, I can hardly breathe. Do you love me like that, Carol? If you care at all about me, please tell me the truth. And then there's a long pause of silence. Carol responds, no, I don't. I do love you, and I want to be with you. Tag kisses Carol's forehead, looks her in the eye, and says, thank you. And Tag walks away. Season 1 of ER concluded. I often think about our love for one another and for the world. As I've said recently, probably the hardest part about loving sometimes is loving the unlovable. For those that we have a bit of grief with, perhaps they're unlovable because in our own sensibilities, or perhaps in our own annoyance, we find them annoying too. Yet, Jesus asks us over and over again, do you love me? When you look over your shoulder and you ask the question, what about? Well, how do you finish the sentence or the question? What about him? What about her? What about the big game tonight? What about the rain? What about my age? What about my gender identity? But the thing is, Jesus asks us, do you love me? Don't worry about the rest and the whatabouts, but follow me.